The night was alive with excitement, but I was about to find out that not everything on that stage was as bright and shiny as it seemed. It was July 31st, 1969, and I, Elvis Presley, was back where I belonged, in the spotlight, performing in Las Vegas. The International Hotel was packed, and the energy was electric. I stepped onto the stage, tan, fit, and ready to take on the world. The crowd roared, and I felt a wave of adrenaline hit me. I was home. I had been away from the live stage for almost a decade, but I was determined to make a comeback. I had been recording at American Sound, and it reignited my passion for music. But it was this moment, standing under the lights, that brought back the fire in my belly. I wanted to show everyone that Elvis was back, and I was going to do it with every ounce of energy I had. I had control over everything. I chose the musicians, the songs, and the overall vibe. I wanted to showcase all the music that influenced me: black gospel, white gospel, country, R&B, and rock and roll. I brought in the Imperials, a white male gospel quartet, and the Sweet Inspirations, a black female quartet, to back me up. I wanted the sound to be big and full, and I wasn't going to settle for anything less. I hired the best, and I paid for it out of my own salary. It didn't matter. I was determined to make this the best show anyone had ever seen. Opening night was a success. Celebrities like Cary Grant, Carol Channing, and Sammy Davis Jr. were there. Priscilla, my wife, was in the audience too. It was her first official Elvis concert, and I was happy to have her there. Sam Phillips, the man who gave me my first chance in the music business, was in the audience. After the show, he told me, "I've never seen a better rhythm section in my life." I beamed with pride. It felt like I was back on top, but the road ahead was going to be tough. I committed to working 7 nights a week, 2 shows a night, for 4 weeks straight. It was a grueling schedule, and I knew it. But I was determined to prove that I could still do it. I didn't want to be just another performer. I wanted to be the best. The first engagement alone consisted of 57 shows in just 4 weeks. Each show ran for about an hour and 15 minutes, and I gave it everything I had. The crowd loved it, and I felt alive, but the reality of the situation hit me hard. The shows were draining, and I started to feel the toll on my body. I had a sore throat and a fever, but I pushed through. I couldn't let my fans down. I took pills to keep me going, to help me sleep, and to give me the energy I needed. It wasn't just about the shows. It was about survival. The next few years were a blur of performances, tours, and constant pressure. I played over 1,137 live shows across the country, and every single one sold out. I was the biggest star in the world, but the price was high. My immune system and major organs were overburdened, and my body just couldn't keep up. I started to rely more and more on prescription drugs, and it became a cycle I couldn't break. Graceland was my sanctuary. It was a place where I could escape the chaos and be with my family. Priscilla, Lisa Marie, and my extended family lived on the property. The Memphis Mafia, my loyal friends and employees, were always around. It felt like a real family, and I wanted everyone to feel that way. I gave out cars, jewelry, and even had a TCB taking care of business logo with a lightning bolt made into pendants and necklaces for everyone. It was my way of showing that we were all in this together. But the road was taking its toll on more than just my body. My marriage to Priscilla was struggling. She was trying to provide a stable home for Lisa Marie, and I was constantly on the road. The women in my life were a mix of short-term relationships and longer ones. I tried to balance it all, but it was a constant battle. I wanted to be a good husband and father, but I also wanted to be a free man. It was a struggle I never quite figured out. As I stood on that stage in 1969, I had no idea what the next few years would bring. I was on top of the world, but the road ahead was going to be a tough one. I just hoped I could keep up. I remember the times I spent with Elvis, and they were different from what the guys in his circle saw. With us, he wasn't always the tough boss. He could let his guard down, and we noticed things about him that others didn't. Like how cold his room always was, with air conditioners blowing directly on him. We saw how much he loved his mom, but it wasn't in a weird way. We also noticed his health issues first. Barbara Lee, one of his girlfriends, told me that touring made Elvis weak because he didn't get enough rest or proper food. His nervous system was off. which made him take more pills. She said Elvis always carried the physician's desk reference, a book that made him feel like he was in control of his drug use, even though it gave him a false sense of security. Kathy Westmoreland, a background singer, joined Elvis's group in 1970 and stayed until he died in 1977. She saw how well organized everything was and how Elvis treated everyone with respect. He introduced new people to everyone and made sure they felt comfortable. Even back then, she noticed his health problems. She talked about his weak heart, which he inherited from his family. She saw the effects of antibiotics, steroids, and other health issues. When she saw him without clothes, she noticed how thin his arms and legs were, but his torso looked like he had swallowed a watermelon. Elvis's day and night schedule was also not good for him. He went out at night to avoid being mobbed by fans. He couldn't say no to fans, so he chose to live at night. This meant he didn't get enough vitamin D from the sun, which is important for your immune system. Larry Geller tried to give him vitamins, but Dr. Nick told him not to bother. Elvis suffered from respiratory illnesses often, and vitamin D could have helped him. Elvis did almost everything at night. He rented movie theaters and fairgrounds after hours, had dentist appointments, and visited police departments. He admired law enforcement and had a police radio in his car. He also started collecting police badges, which allowed him and his friends to carry guns. In 1970, he even met President Nixon to get a Federal Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs badge. He wanted to help fight the drug problem that was affecting the country, especially the youth. In 1971, Elvis was named one of the 10 Outstanding Young Men of the Year by the Junior Chamber of Commerce. He accepted the award in person and gave a speech about his dreams coming true. He talked about the importance of faith, brotherhood, and service. After the award, he hosted a cocktail hour at Graceland and a dinner for the other recipients. The award was important to him, and he carried it with him everywhere. In the 1970s, Elvis's aviator sunglasses became a big part of his look, but they weren't just for fashion. He had serious eye problems, like migraine headaches and sensitivity to light. In 1970, he had an infection in his left eye, and in 1971, he had severe eye pain in his right eye. Doctors diagnosed him with iritis and secondary glaucoma. He had to stop recording songs for a while because of the eye pain. The doctors thought the black hair dye he used on his eyebrows might have caused the problems, but it could also have been from his autoimmune disorders. Elvis had chronic iritis, which is unusual because it usually goes away after a few months. His immune system was already weak, so fighting infections was hard for him. Elvis was a complex person, and the women in his life saw a different side of him. They noticed his vulnerabilities and his health issues, and they cared for him deeply. Despite everything, he kept performing and doing what he loved, even when it was tough. Elvis and I got to know each other really well over the years. I saw him go through a lot, and one of the most serious things was his eye problem. It all started with something called iritis, which is when the colored part of your eye, the iris, gets inflamed. This can happen over and over, and when it does, it can lead to a much bigger problem called glaucoma. Glaucoma is when the pressure inside your eye gets too high, and it can damage your optic nerve, which is the part that helps you see. One day, Elvis was in Nashville, and his eye pressure was really high. Dr. Mayer, the eye doctor, told him it was an emergency. He said Elvis's eye pressure was over 80, which is way too high. Normal eye pressure is around 10. Dr. Mayer said, "Mr. Presley, your pupil has no movement. This is a very bad sign of very serious condition." He gave Elvis two choices. They could make a hole in his iris with surgery, or he could get an injection of steroids to lower the pressure. Elvis chose the injection. Dr. Mayer put the shot right into Elvis's eye, and the pressure started to go down right away. After the injection, Elvis had to wear a patch over his eye for a few weeks and dark sunglasses, most of the time because his eyes were really sensitive to light. He still performed on stage, even with the cameras and spotlights. But the eye problems were just one of the many things he had to deal with. He started taking prescription medications to help him perform and feel better. When Elvis was discharged from the hospital, his girlfriend Joyce Bove came to meet him in Nashville and fly back to Memphis with him. She was shocked by how weak and sick he looked. Even getting out of the car and walking up the steps to Graceland was hard for him. Dr. Mayer told Joyce about the medications and the oxygen tank he left for Elvis if he needed it. Joyce was worried and thought there might be more to the story than what she was being told. Elvis's wife, Priscilla, was in California during this time, building her own life. She was only 26, and being away from Elvis made her realize she had her own interests and needs. She knew about the other women in Elvis's life, and how being adored by fans every night was affecting him. She felt like she couldn't reach him anymore. She said, "I think that deep down he wanted to be a family man, but he was serving too many masters, he was too dispersed." Priscilla wanted a husband and father, but Elvis couldn't stop being the entertainer. He had a lot of responsibilities and dependence, and he saw prescription medication as a way to keep going, like a crutch to heal a broken bone. Elvis's health problems didn't just start with his eyes. He had ear infections, tonsillitis, and other illnesses that kept getting worse over the years. His immune system was weak, and he needed more and more medication to keep up. His health declined, and he had to go to the hospital more often. The drugs he took were both a help and a problem. They let him keep performing, but they also made him more dependent on them. Elvis's grandmother, Minnie Me, was a constant presence at Graceland. Everyone called her Grandma, but Elvis always called her Dodger. She became a symbol of home and family. When Elvis was on the road or in Vegas, Dodger kept Graceland a home. She was the one who stayed in the back bedroom, the same room Gladys used to sleep in. She was a reminder of who Elvis was and where he came from. Even when he was a star, she kept him grounded. Minnie Me had a strong bond with Priscilla, especially when Elvis was away making movies. Priscilla spent a lot of time in Grandma's room, listening to her stories about Elvis's early years and the family's struggles. Minnie Me had been through a lot, including the divorce from her husband, Jesse D. Presley, who left her and their children. She became the matriarch of the family, and when Elvis and Priscilla's marriage ended, it was hard for everyone, especially Minnie Me. She hated to see Priscilla go and hoped they would spend more time together. As Elvis's eye problems got worse, he turned to Dodger for support. They both had to wear dark glasses all the time because of their sensitivity to light. Dodger had a lot of eye problems, and she had to use eye drops several times a day. It's possible that Elvis inherited his eye issues from her. Steroids, which he took for other health problems, might have made his glaucoma worse. Elvis's health issues and the medications he took were a big part of his life, but he tried to keep them hidden. He wanted to be the king of rock and roll, but he also needed his family and the comfort of Graceland to keep him grounded. Even though he had a lot of challenges, he kept going, and his family, especially Dodger, was always there for him. Elvis' health problems, especially his intestinal issues, have always been a bit of a mystery. But the more I dive into it, the clearer it becomes that his bowel problems were something he dealt with his whole life, way before fame and drugs came into the picture. When I was a kid, I heard stories from my dad's side of the family that made it clear Elvis struggled with this from the start. One of my dad's cousins, Annie Presley, told a story about how Elvis's mom, Gladys, had to help him when he was little. Little Elvis couldn't go to the bathroom on his own, so Gladys had to use milk of magnesia and even more extreme measures to help him. It was tough for a little kid and his mom, but they did what they had to do. As Elvis grew older, the problem didn't go away. In fact, it got worse. My Aunt Delta, who lived with us at Graceland, was pretty blunt about it. Once at a family dinner, she asked me in front of everyone, "Lisa, have you had a bowel movement today?" I was 10, and it was super embarrassing. But it was a real issue, and I remember always having problems with it. My dad's side of the family seemed to have the same issues, so it was definitely something we inherited. Elvis's cousin, Valeria Presley Schaffner, died at 32 from intestinal problems in 1975. It was a tough time for our family, and it made me wonder if there was a connection. Valeria's uncle, Larry Presley, said she had a really noisy stomach all the time. It was like her intestines were always working, but not in a good way. It's sad to think that maybe, if we knew more about her condition, we could have helped Elvis better. Another relative, Sales Presley, died at 33 from intestinal trouble in 1951. It's clear that this was a family issue and it affected Elvis deeply. He was so private about it though. Even when he was in pain, he didn't want to talk about it. One time, his girlfriend Joyce Bover remembered him being in so much pain that they had to fly back to Memphis. Dr. Nick, his doctor, tried to help, but it was a constant battle. Dr. Nick said that Elvis's colon was so enlarged that it was like a big, packed tube. It was filled with hard, clay-like poop that had been stuck there for a long time. This condition, called a megacolon, is really serious. Some doctors think Elvis might have had Hirschsprung's disease, which means he was born without the nerve cells that help the colon work properly. It would explain why he had trouble from the beginning. There were times when Elvis was offered surgery to help, but he didn't want to go through with it. He was so worried about how it would look, and he didn't want to admit how bad it was. But Dr. Nick and other doctors said that surgery was the only way to really fix it. Without it, Elvis was in constant pain and had to use lots of laxatives just to go to the bathroom. On top of all that, Elvis had another condition called Reiter's syndrome, which caused joint pain, eye infections, and other issues. It was triggered by infections in his intestines, which were already a mess because of his bowel problems. It's like everything was working against him. Elvis's health issues were a big part of his life, and they probably contributed to his early death. It's hard to think about how much he must have suffered, but it's important to remember that he was human just like the rest of us. He had his struggles, and he did his best to keep going, even when it was tough. Elvis and I, we had been through a lot. His personal life was in turmoil, but his career was hitting new heights. He was recording sad songs like For the Good Times and Always on My Mind, reflecting the pain of his split with Priscilla. One of the Memphis Mafia, Red West, even wrote separate ways about it. After recording, Elvis would sit and listen to it for hours, lost in his thoughts. Despite everything, Elvis was still a star. The documentary Elvis on Tour was a huge success, and he became the first to sell out 4 shows at Madison Square Garden. At the press conference, he said something that stuck with me. The image is one thing and a human being is another. It's very hard to live up to an image. In the summer of 1972, Elvis met Linda Thompson, a beautiful young woman who made him feel more like himself. They connected over their southern roots and shared faith. Linda moved into Graceland, and their relationship was a bright spot for Elvis. He felt a responsibility to take care of everyone around him, from the Memphis Mafia to his family and all the people involved in his tours, but the toll was starting to show. Even those who had been around him for years could see he was struggling. The constant touring, the pain from arthritis, and the other health issues were taking their toll. Despite this, Elvis still managed to put on incredible shows. He was a performer through and through. In January 1973, the Colonel came up with a brilliant idea: a live satellite concert from Hawaii. Aloha from Hawaii was a massive event, seen by an estimated 1.5 billion people around the world. Elvis looked fit and healthy, but it was a facade. For weeks leading up to the concert, he was on a dangerous crash diet of only 500 calories a day. He lost 25 pounds, but it was a huge strain on his already fragile health. The night after the concert, Elvis was completely drained. He didn't even have the energy to talk about his success. Dr. Nick, who was always there for him, said Elvis was totally depleted. It was clear that the Aloha concert marked a turning point. From then on, Elvis's health declined rapidly. His drug use increased as he tried to manage the pain and keep up with his demanding schedule. Elvis didn't want to be high, he just wanted to function. He wanted to keep performing and giving his all. But as his body aged and the pain worsened, he turned to more and more medication. It was a vicious cycle, and it only got worse as the years went on. By 1977, Elvis barely resembled the man we saw in Hawaii just 4 years earlier. His health had deteriorated so much that it was heartbreaking to watch. Elvis was a complex person, a mix of the image and the human being. He gave everything he had to his music and his fans, even when it meant pushing his body to the limit. But in the end, the strain was too much, and it showed in the final years of his life. Elvis never slowed down, even when he was so tired. Right after the big Aloha concert, he did 168 shows in 1973, the most he ever did in a year. Sonny West, one of Elvis' friends, said Elvis needed a break, but he just worked harder. Elvis left Hawaii, and went to Los Angeles on January 15th. By the 18th, he was already in Las Vegas for rehearsals. He was going to do 57 shows in 28 days. Charlie Hodge, another friend, said keeping up with Elvis on stage was exhausting. Elvis moved so much and had so much energy that it took all of their energy just to keep up, but Elvis was really tired. He had been on a very strict diet, only eating about 500 calories a day for 6 weeks. His doctor, Dr. Nick, was worried about him. Elvis even got sick and had to cancel some shows. During one show, he left the stage because his voice gave out. He came back and told everyone he had the flu, and his voice disappeared. Elvis started to gain weight after his diet, and his friends noticed he was in a lot of pain. The press wrote not so nice things about his shows. Jerry Schilling, another friend, said Elvis was really vulnerable and wasn't the superhuman he used to be. Elvis was also going through a lot of emotional trouble. He wanted the guys to hire someone to hurt Priscilla's new boyfriend. He was really upset about his family breaking apart. Elvis needed money for his divorce from Priscilla. The Colonel, his manager, made a deal with RCA for $5,400,000, but the Colonel got more money than Elvis. Elvis signed a new contract with RCA and the Colonel, and they split the profits. The Colonel took a lot of money, but Elvis didn't have much left. Elvis went on tour again in April. It was very tiring. They played 2 shows a day in some cities. Nurse Tish Henley Kirk said tours were very hard, especially for someone who wasn't feeling well. Elvis barely had time to rest between shows. Dr. Nick tried to get Elvis to do fewer shows, but the Colonel wanted to make as much money as possible. Elvis did another long engagement at the Sahara Tahoe Resort in May. He even did a special Mother's Day show. But he got sick again and had to cancel some shows. He was taken to the hospital, but no one knows what happened there. The Colonel and Elvis' dad, Vernon, started to look into where Elvis was getting his drugs. They found out about 3 doctors and a dentist. They even hired a lawyer and started to watch the mail. Elvis tried to say he had his drug problem under control, but it didn't last long. He went on another tour and played 10 cities in 13 days. In June, Elvis had another scary moment. He was barely breathing and unconscious. Dr. Nick thought Elvis might have had a seizure. He gave Elvis a stimulant and put him in cold water to help him. Amazingly, Elvis went on stage that night. Elvis went back to the studio in July and did another month-long engagement in Vegas in August. But the reviews were not good. People said Elvis was fat and not his usual self. No one outside his inner circle knew about his health problems or his drug use. Elvis was getting sick with breathing and lung problems a lot. He had to get treatments and even hired a masseur to help with the mucus in his lungs. Elvis didn't like playing Vegas anymore. He thought the shows were boring, and he resented having to do them because of the Colonel's gambling debts. One night, Lucille Ball came to see Elvis' show. She asked him what he was taking and told him he didn't need it. Elvis didn't like that and had her shown the door. No one was allowed to question what was happening with Elvis' health. Elvis fired the Colonel after a fight, but it didn't last. The Colonel asked for a lot of money, and Elvis didn't have it, so they had to work together again. Elvis and Priscilla got divorced on October 9, 1973. It cost Elvis about $1,500,000. They held hands and said goodbye. Elvis and Priscilla stayed friends and talked on the phone a lot. They were still close, especially when it came to their daughter, Lisa Marie. Less than a week after the divorce, Elvis had a big collapse. Dr. Nick said he almost died. Everyone blamed it on the drugs, but Elvis had real health problems too. He had a family history of heart disease and a lot of other issues from when he was young. Elvis went to the hospital, and Dr. Nick was very worried. Elvis was so swollen and puffy that he looked completely different. Dr. Nick thought it might be an allergic reaction or heart failure. They did a lot of tests, but they couldn't figure out what was wrong. Elvis was in a lot of pain and everyone was scared. It was a scary time for everyone. Elvis went through a really tough time when the doctors found out his swelling was because of a condition called Cushing's syndrome. This happens when your body gets too much of a hormone called cortisol, which is made in these little glands above your kidneys. Sometimes your body makes too much on its own, but it can also happen if you take certain medicines for a long time. like the ones Elvis was getting for his pain. The doctors noticed some bruises on Elvis, and at first he said it was from acupuncture. But later we found out it was from injections he was getting to help with his pain. Dr. Leon Cole, who was treating Elvis for his severe arthritis, had been giving him a lot of shots of pain medicine and cortisone. This helped with the pain, but it also made Elvis dependent on the pain medicine Demerol, which is really dangerous, especially for someone with breathing problems. Elvis had to stay in the hospital for over 2 weeks to get off the Demerol. His girlfriend, Linda Thompson, stayed with him and even had her own hospital bed. She said it was almost like being at home, except everything was a bit more serious. The doctors and nurses were trying to help Elvis get better, but they found out he had more problems than just the pain and drugs. One of the big issues was that Elvis had hepatitis, which is when your liver gets inflamed. This was partly because of the excess cortisone, but he also had a genetic condition called alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency. This can make your liver and lungs really sick. On top of that, Elvis had a swollen colon and a bleeding ulcer in his stomach. Dr. Lawrence Rubble, a specialist, told Elvis he had to stop doing 2 shows a night because it was killing him. Elvis didn't want to, but he had to compromise and cut his Vegas shows from 4 weeks to 2. After all this, Dr. Nick became Elvis' personal doctor to keep an eye on his medications. He and Joe Esposito, one of Elvis' friends, went through Elvis' room at Graceland and threw out a bunch of pills. Dr. Nick wanted to control what Elvis took, but Elvis was upset because he thought he could take care of himself. Dr. Nick started giving Elvis placebos instead of real pills to help him get off the drugs. When Elvis got back home, Dr. Nick focused on his insomnia, which was making him really tired and sick. He tried to help Elvis sleep without pills, but after 3 days of not sleeping, they had to give him a sedative. Even though Elvis seemed better for a while, he started taking more pills again when he went back to his busy concert schedule. Elvis' health problems kept coming back. The cortisone injections he got for his pain had messed up his adrenal glands, which are important for dealing with stress. This made it hard for Elvis to handle the stress of his shows and tours. Dr. Nick tried to help by giving him a hormone called Acth, but it was a constant struggle to keep Elvis healthy. In 1974, things seemed to be getting better for a while. Linda Thompson said Elvis was more energetic and focused, but it didn't last. He kept pushing himself too hard and taking more pills to deal with the pain and stress. The cycle of concerts, drugs, and hospital stays continued, and it was taking a toll on everyone around him. Dr. Nick tried his best, but it was a never-ending battle to keep Elvis healthy and alive. Elvis was always there for everyone else, but it seemed like no one was there for him. I remember the last time I saw him before he left for a tour. He said goodbye to Aunt Nash, and she looked worried. "Elvis, I wish you didn't have to leave," she said, and he replied, "I do too, Aunt Nash, but there are too many people depending on me." That was just who he was. He gave, and even when he was exhausted, he kept pushing himself to the limit to make sure everyone else was happy. When Elvis came back from his hospital stay in October 1973, he tried to take better care of himself. The shows in Las Vegas were good, and the reviews were great. But even with shorter engagements, the strain was still there. 2 shows a night every night, just to keep up with what everyone expected from him. The tours were even harder. There was always a doctor or nurse with us, and Tish the nurse was like a sergeant, making sure Elvis took care of himself. I remember one time, Tish weighed Elvis's suit before and after a show. It was 8 pounds heavier after the show, and he still had another one to do that night. It was exhausting, but he never let it show on stage. He wanted his fans to get their money's worth, even if it meant pushing himself to the brink. Elvis was a dad too, and Lisa Marie was growing up. He tried to be there for her, even when his behavior was getting more erratic. He would take her to parent-teacher conferences and make sure she had the best medical care. He was proud of that, but it also reminded him of his own childhood, when his parents couldn't afford to take him to the doctor. He never wanted his daughter to feel that way. By 1974, Elvis was performing more than ever. The shows were sold out, but they were taking a toll on his health. He had his own private doctor, but he also had other doctors who would give him whatever he wanted, no questions asked. It was a dangerous cycle, and it was only getting worse. During one tour, Elvis was so sick that he had to leave the stage after just 30 minutes. He was running on fumes, and it was starting to show. His voice was hoarse, and his tonsils were a constant problem. But he was afraid to have them removed because he thought it might change his voice, so he kept pushing through the pain. Lamar, one of Elvis's closest friends, told me that Elvis's tonsils were in bad shape. They had holes in them, and they were causing him a lot of trouble. But Elvis was too scared to take the risk. It was a small thing, but it represented the bigger problem. Elvis was afraid to slow down, even when he needed to. By the time we got to Lake Tahoe, things were really bad. Elvis's dad, Vernon, called Dr. Nick to come help. Dr. Nick found Elvis unable to keep his balance and having muscle control problems. It was clear that something was seriously wrong. Dr. Nick tried to help, but it was a losing battle. Elvis was his own worst enemy, always looking for a quick fix rather than taking the time to heal properly. Even though Dr. Nick knew more about Elvis's health than anyone else, he couldn't fix everything. Elvis was dealing with problems that no one knew about, and the medicine of the 1970s had its limits. Elvis would read medical books and think he knew how to treat himself, but it only made things worse. One of the craziest things Elvis did was sign up for Dr. Gainham's sleep diet. It was basically a sedation diet, where Elvis would be put to sleep for weeks at a time. He did it twice in 1974, and it was just another example of him trying to find a quick fix. It didn't help, and it only added to the pressure he was already under. Despite everything, Elvis kept going. He was a performer to the very end, and he never stopped giving his all to his fans, but the toll it took on him was immense. He was a complex person, and even those of us who were closest to him only knew part of the story. Elvis Presley was a legend, but he was also just a man, trying to find his way in a world that never let him rest.